Welcome back to the 4-part series on how to make space ambient music. As promised last week, today in the second part, we're looking at sound design. How can we use synthesizers to create those classic space sounds? How can we make different sounds that will fit well together? And how can we use effects like reverb and delay especially to create the space ambience? Hope you enjoy. Okay, folks, so how can we approach the sound design of space music? What I want to do today is take you through how I designed and what inspired the sounds that I made for the jam that you heard last time. So we're going to go through individual instruments and their role in the overall composition, talking really about the sound. Now, invoking space vibes for me kind of has two elements. One is, what do we think space sounds like? So usually when we use those words, at least in electronic music, we think about big reverbs, evoking massive caves, cavernous spaces that we are inside of with kind of a stereo reverb experience. This is kind of funny because in space there actually is no sound because it's vacuum, but that's certainly what kind of creates the feeling that we often talk about when we discuss kind of space ambient vibes. The other part is kind of a cultural. What are we associated with images of aliens, with planets, with stardust and stars? So you kind of go back to sci-fi movies of the 1950s and sounds kind of like this. Right? Evoking kind of aliens, weird pitch bending stuff. Lots of movies have played a really important role here. We can go back to Star Wars, John Williams, and Blade Runner. So all this stuff is kind of in a mix when we're trying to create spacey vibes. The way I've kind of approached it is, let's think about the leads, the main sounds, the basses, and how this stuff is going to work together. Often in space music, you don't have really kind of a band setup. You have an orchestra setup, often with a theme or a melody, and really just creating lots of sonic textures around that. As a result, kind of made sounds both for the bass and for the lead that are basically going to be layered or work together. So let's look at this lead sound. Basically sawtooth waves with a slight vibrato, basically an LFO for the pitch. Now we can really hear it. We have a little beating from different oscillators. Already sounds pretty trippy. But the spacey part also involves that reverb we talked about. So here we're looking at a kind of a shimmer or a riser type reverb, one that kind of plays the same note in octaves above and then an octave above and creates this shimmer over the top. So let's see how that sounds like. So this is with pretty long decay time. This is a bit shorter. But that really means that just this sound can fill a lot of space and invokes kind of an angelic tone. So that's one key sound we're going to use here today. Now, what about the bass sound? As I mentioned, those are going to be layered. Okay, we'll get to the strings. So you'll notice that there's kind of a pluck, but then also a level of sustain. And we need to dial in exactly where this filter is going to sit once we think about the general context. And when we reconnect the MIDI. Okay, so we want some body in the bass. Basically what we're dealing here with is a square sub oscillator. And then we have sawtooth and a pulse wave. Okay. This is really to kind of provide some ground to the whole sound. It's not really something that's going to be forward in the mix, but it's going to really help thicken up the whole situation. The other thing you can hear is a critical part of the sound is this funky delay. So here we just have the bass, and listen as we add this kind of a pitch LFO type delayed signal. Notice also that this is kind of spread across the stereo spectrum. So just like with this lead, just these two things really kind of cover some ground. So we can really evoke some spacey vibes just with these two sounds working together. What about the background, the harmonic backdrop? For that, we're turning to Solina strings. Now, you may not have this, but this is the sound going back to string machines of the 1970s, including the Solina itself, and then Korg machines and other types of synths that were used by rock bands and electronic musicians from the 70s, and are kind of ingrained in a cultural notion of what sounds spacey. Now, if you just listen to these oscillators by themselves, they sound pretty good. Without modulation, not so great, but with modulation, pretty great. But what makes it really spacey is when we turn on this phaser, which kind of emulates the small stone phaser that, for example, Jean-Michel Jarre used in the 70s. Now it immediately sounds like space, which is one reason I love this thing and I use it. Now, if you don't have something like this, well, you can make your own strings. So, for example, okay, something like this that you can pull off on almost any synthesizer. Okay, let's get back to where we were. So we kind of have this backdrop of the strings. We have some percussion here I'll talk about later. And we talked about this bass, which actually here is kind of used as a high-level pluck, but once we get to the meat of the composition, we're back in a lower register. Notice there's a timing on the delay, so it works with the tempo of the song. But not too perfect. Then arpeggio. You have to have arpeggio. I think this sort of high sprinkle sound type arpeggio really evokes space because they emulate stardust. So Pest is a kind of West Coast synth. Has a pretty simple waveforms, but they're going through this wave folder. And really no filter, although you can kind of adjust the sustain. So again, this arpeggio is using more acceptable notes in the D minor scale, which everything's based on more or less here. The key thing about this arpeggio, notice that it's kind of coming in and out. So there's an LFO here, and that LFO is sent to the fold modulation. So basically, this is opening and closing, but slowly. This is really important because this is constantly playing, otherwise it would get really overwhelming and we want that feeling of something slowly receding and returning. Okay, so that's key element that also provides some background together with this granular delay. So if we kill this stuff and just listen to this synth, so this is raw, but then this granular delay kind of repeats the sound in small packets. We can adjust various parameters here I'm not going to get into. And again, this makes copies upward in the sound spectrum, basically an octave up, similar as this riser reverb on the Minilogue. This is again created effervescent, angelic vibe. Okay, and now we need some weird space alien stuff, right? Some noise, just weirdness, because there's weird stuff in space. So this is a batch here that really just has some funny routings. Really, we're having that filter go really quickly, and noise as well, and depending on sort of where you press the key, it's going to be more or less. So again, the filter is not opening so much here, it's opening here. Let's see what we have in this modulation matrix. So again, there's a pressure coming to the filter. Oscillator 2 is going to the cutoff, so again, the higher notes will overall sound brighter than the lower notes. Oscillator 2 is going to the noise, so again, one level of noise, high level of noise. LFO is going to panning, so the other thing you can hear is we have this left to right motion, which is pretty slow. Again, we can adjust how fast it is over here. But I like this speed. Okay, oscillator 2 to all oscillator pulse width modulation. Again, such that basically as we go up the keyboard, the rates and the height of the frequencies of all the weird stuff goes up, and as we go down the keyboard, it goes down. And that, once you kind of put it with a melody, for example, so I'm actually just routing this main melody of this piece through this. We can't really hear the notes very well, but that's not the point. It just reinforces the rhythmic motif. And I can affect the sound too, that's more in pace with the music. Okay, and then we kind of need a lead arpeggio, another arpeggio, why not? For that, I really wanted kind of a strumming instrument, something that sounds like a heavenly ukulele or a harpsichord. So for a final touch of a spacey, heavenly ukulele vibe, there's this strummer patch that plays another arpeggio. I think it really works well with these other sounds. And that's basically our sound palette here. Notice that each sound has its own space and place and a role. These strings are in the background, and this arpeggio is dutifully working in the background, but they're not getting in each other's way. The bass is also kind of tucked in, really just to provide that girth. These are really plucky, really bright sounds, so they kind of cut through everything. And the percussion really plays mostly a supporting role. We have this hi-hat just to kind of drive beat. Heartbeat. So that's kind of the basics of sound design here. Sounds that work well together, a use of reverb to kind of fill out the space, but making sure things don't get in each other's way. Next time, we're going to discuss about composition and melodies and how these sounds can work together to work with the melody and the harmony that's driving this piece of music. Thank you, and see you next time.